Und jetzt möchte ich Jeremy bitten, auf die Bühne zu kommen, seine Bewertung hier vorzutragen, weil er mit seinem Land, mit Großbritannien, auch den Nachweis führen kann, dass dort auch nationale Kämpfe geführt werden, scharfe Kämpfe, weil auch dort klar ist, die Völker bezahlen nicht nur die Kriege mit ihrem Leben, sondern sie bezahlen sie auch mit ihrem Geld. Und das führt dazu, dass auch selbst Tarifkämpfe eine andere Qualität bekommen. Jeremy, ich freue mich auf deine Ausführungen.
Thank you, Hubert, and thank you very, very much to everyone here for inviting me to speak to this very important conference. Danke, la Wasser. And a huge thank you to Heinz and Ulrike for arranging this event, and the speeches we've already heard today are, to me, very, very inspirational. Laura Alvarez, my wife, who's here on the front row, and I are both representing the Peace and Justice Project, which we established after the 2019 election defeat in Britain. We have over 50,000 supporters around the UK, and we see ourselves as providing a political home for people that have found themselves homeless after the changes in the Labour Party and other things that have happened since 2019. We're not a political party, we're more of a political movement that provides space for people, and Laura's role in the organisation is to be our international coordinator, and in that capacity works very hard with various unions, including the International Transport Federation, over improving union rights and recognition, particularly in Latin America, as well as obviously supporting the huge wave of strikes that are going on at the present time in Britain. And so I've been asked by Heinz ever so politely to limit myself to 20 minutes. He has an unfortunate experience of my limiting of speeches in the past, so I'll do my best today to stick to that, and I promised I would, and there's a whole phalanx of people on the front row that are going to jump on the stage and take me away if I go on too long. But I want to say what a lovely place and what a lovely atmosphere in which you've organised this event today. The issues that we face are huge at the present time. There is the issue of working class living standards in Europe. There is the issue of declining living standards of the poorest people around the world. And there is also the issue of the grotesque levels of inequality that are growing in every European society, in the United States, and all across the globe. And we have a global media that extols the virtues of the super rich at the expense of the rest. I'll give you just one example of that media. Obviously, what happened with that submarine, tourist submarine in the North Atlantic, was tragic. I'm sorry at the loss of life. Millions of dollars were spent on a rescue operation. Every media outlet in the world gave it wall-to-wall coverage. 500 desperate people died off the coast of Greece. Human beings just like all of us here today in Hanau. And where was the media coverage of the rescue attempts for them, the attempt to find the bodies and all the other things? That's an example of the way in which the media narrative forms public opinion and anesthetizes us to the pain that so many people who are victims of global capitalism, of xenophobia, of war are ignored. And so I want to make my speech in essentially two parts. One is about the economic situation in my country, because I think you want to hear something about the wave of strikes that is going on there, and then the latter part on global issues. Essentially, the excuse me, the crisis of living standards goes back to the financial crash of 2008. 2008 financial crash by the excesses of free market capitalism, mainly in the USA, but elsewhere also. That crisis resulted in huge investments by every Western government in bailing out the banks and the banking system and imposing austerity, public spending austerity, on the rest of the population. In varying degrees, it happened differently in different countries. The most brutal form of that austerity was imposed on the people of Greece, where their public services were destroyed or privatized, or in some cases both. Living standards fell, pensions were cut, poverty increased dramatically. The same story happened in many, many other places as well. And in Britain, the coalition government that came in 2010 imposed massive levels of austerity through an emergency budget. But I have to say, in the 2010 election campaign, the then leadership of the Labour Party was promising something broadly similar and saying, if you elect us, there will be massive cuts. If you elect the Tories, there will be massive cuts. There wasn't much of a choice for people in that election campaign between the alternative economic strategies that were being put forward. And so, since 2010, in the case of Britain, working class living standards have fallen by about 20% for the majority of the population. And there are a growth of food banks that I never thought I would ever see. In 2010, in my constituency, which is inner city, North London, very mixed population, very strongly Labour voting over the past 70 years, there are now I think 10 food banks in the constituency. There are 3 branches of McDonald's. And that is the same over the whole country. There are more food banks than there are branches of McDonald's. And the numbers coming to the food banks are growing week on week. There's queues around the block before the food banks open, because they're normally open in different places on a particular day each week. And that is the reality of people's lives. There is also a mental health crisis, partly as the effects of COVID and lockdown had on people's lives, but also the levels of debt and poverty that go with it. And we have insufficiently funded National Health Service, insufficiently funded education, and we have low wages in all of those areas. And so it is this combination of the disastrous position that so many people are in, together with low wages, that has provoked this huge wave of strikes that have happened in Britain over the last few months and are not over yet by any manner of means. The doctors have just voted for another wave of strike action. The railway workers have not settled yet, so they're voting for more strike action. The postal workers have not settled yet, and the teachers are balloting for an all-out strike when the schools return in the autumn. And so, if I just go through the strike wave in turn, rail workers went on strike for wages, but also for working conditions. The cuts in the number of staff on trains make them less safe. The cuts in station staff make the stations less safe. But what's interesting is that the highly skilled central core of the Train Drivers Union, ASLEF, and the RMT, the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, which represents the majority of rail workers, has expanded to include many workers who work for companies contracted to the rail companies for catering, cleaning and everything else, who are often marginalized workers, often migrant women who work in those sectors, have now joined the union and are very much part of that campaign. And this is something that's pretty alarming for the managers of our privatized rail system. I've always made the case for public ownership of the railways. It's never been more necessary and more relevant than now to bring the entire rail system into public ownership. We are very proud of our mail system in Britain. It's been around for 500 years. It was the first universal postal service anywhere in the world. And the privatisation that took place during the coalition government of the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats has been utterly disastrous. there's been speed-ups, there's been computerization of what mail delivery workers do, and the mental health stress level on somebody delivering post, where they're measured step by step as they walk down the street, measured for their time, and are now being threatened by Royal Mail management, which is owned by international hedge funds, with essentially a gig economy model where they would, the drivers of Royal Mail vans would become owners of those vans and contract themselves to Royal Mail, and each postal worker would become an individual contractor to it. The ultimate gig economy to destroy what was an absolutely brilliant and excellent postal service. It still has a universal service obligation. But the wave of strikes have achieved two things. One is, despite the very difficult legal framework to call a strike in Britain, where you have to have a very high turnout and half of the entire workforce voting for a strike, because of the brilliance of the communication system of the union, they've achieved more than that. They achieved a 90% turnout and an 85% vote for strike action on successive occasions, despite all the sacrifices and all the hardships been made. They forced the Royal Mail management to withdraw all the changes proposed in employment conditions. The dispute that's now going on is protecting those workers that were leaders of the local disputes, many of whom have been suspended by Royal Mail management. So the dispute is far from over, but the strength of the union and the support for it remains very, very strong indeed. And the teachers union took strike action with a great deal of criticism from the government and many in the mainstream media. Enormous criticism was made of them, and they were told that unions are dinosaurs. Whenever you call somebody a dinosaur, just remind them of this: dinosaurs lasted a very long time. And the union duly took strike action, and I have been a public sector union organiser before I became a Member of Parliament. I organised in a union then called the National Union of Public Employees. And calling strikes in schools or hospitals was always difficult, because they're very important public services. People rely on them, and if the kids can't go to school, the parents can't go to work, and so on. You know all the difficulties and complications. And we often had some very, very difficult conversations with patients trying to go to hospital when we're on a picket line outside, and likewise with the schools. I was expecting all the same this time. But there I was on picket lines outside schools in my constituency, and parents were coming up with their children on the strike day to give cakes, biscuits, coffee, support and friendship to the teachers, and saying, we're with you because you're doing it for our kids and our education system. And likewise, this has happened with the doctors and so many others. And the union, in a period of less than a month, recruited 60,000 new members into union membership, because they could see the value of the work that was being done by the union. So these are times when, sadly, the Labour Party's economic message has become very moderate. Beyond moderate, it's become an acceptance of so much into a sort of management economic language. At the same time, the trade unions have become much more active, much more militant, and the politics that was there in the Labour Party up until 2019 is actually now on the picket lines all over the country. And many of the people that I worked with during successive election campaigns, I now meet them in demonstrations and on picket lines all over the country. And interestingly, all of the meetings and rallies and demonstrations, of which there are many, welcome people to speak on behalf of housing campaigns, on behalf of refugee rights, on behalf of mental health campaigns, poverty and so much else. All of the unions now accept that when we go into an industrial battle, it is not just about the wages and conditions at that workplace. It is about the nature of the work we live in the society we live in, and it is about the esteem of working class communities. And as Mick Lynch puts it, the working class is back with a vengeance, and strong and powerful. The other side of it that I just want to quickly draw your attention to is the growth of unions in the gig economy, often small new unions, not necessarily involved with traditional union structures. That's not unique to Britain. It also happens in France. I believe it also happens here in Germany, and certainly happens in the USA and across Latin America. Across the world, there are hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, of predominantly young people, often without settled status in the country they're working in, employed by Deliveroo, by Uber Eats, and by so many other companies. Their work relies on having a mobile phone. That's all. Their only qualification to get a job is having a mobile phone, so they can get a text message which says whether somebody requires a sushi that night or a pizza that night or something else, and they then jump on a bike, deliver it, and then they're out of work until the next message comes on the phone. There are no conditions of employment, there is no protection, there is no safety, and I've met some delivery workers in London who've never ever spoken to anyone who is allegedly their employer. Laura and I met a group of delivery workers who'd formed a union in Bogota, in Colombia. Thousands of them had joined it, despite all the dangers. They couldn't find out who their employer actually was, where the company was registered, who was making money out of it, or what they were doing. This is a twilight economy across the whole world. And so in our project, the Project for Peace and Justice, we're working with and supporting those organizations of the new unions, and we're also supporting the unionization of Amazon and Starbucks, Uber Eats, and all the others, because that's where the trade union and left movements have got to be, in bringing those grossly exploited, predominantly young workers as part of our much wider labour movement, to give them the support and solidarity that they need. They're just as exploited as building workers were in the past. And so there are alternatives, there are alternative policies that have to be put forward. And through our project, we've produced 5 points, and I'll quickly go through them, because these are 5 points we put out as part of a national campaign, and thousands of people have signed up for them. They're not the last word in every detail of every political manifesto we would write, but they're, I think, important points to unify people across the spectrum, and they're just as applicable in every other country as in my own. 1, a wage rise for all, at least in line with inflation. If wages don't rise with inflation, then living standards fall. And most of the unions that have won cases in Britain have won at least a cost of living wage rise, in some cases more. And unions with a very large strike fund, like Unite the Union, have been much more successful in smaller private sector strike actions than others, because they've got the strength and the backup to do it. Secondly, the question of public ownership and control, initially, of our major services. I put forward in our manifesto in 2019 public ownership of the mail system, the rail system, the water system, and the energy system as a very basis of how we go forward. Because if we don't do that, then we will continue to have the destruction and atomization of services, poor working conditions, and in the case of the water industry, which is entirely privatized in Britain, an incredibly dangerous situation. I just give you a quick figure. Many of you will have heard of Loch Ness, I'm sure. It's a huge loch in Scotland, and it's got a monster in it, apparently, but it's quite hard to find that monster. I think it's probably called Boris Johnson, but there we are. But that loch, which is the biggest freshwater lake in probably in much of Western Europe before you get to Switzerland, would fill up every year with the water that's wasted by English water companies because they don't repair the pipe system. And last year, there were 300,000, get that figure, 300,000 leaks of raw sewage into English rivers and the sea. No English river is now safe to swim in. Most beaches are now dangerous to go on. because the water companies have made billions in profit, sold off assets, and are mostly domiciled in tax havens in the Caribbean, South Asia, the Pacific, or somewhere else. It's the biggest rip-off of public investment that I've ever seen in my life, is the theft of water assets by these companies. There's an overwhelming case to take them back into public ownership and run it democratically by those that are capable of doing so. The third point of our 5 points is on housing. We have a housing crisis, as many do across Europe. A crisis of the lack of building, of council housing. In our case, it's usually called social housing elsewhere. Massive housing waiting lists, massive housing needs, and increase in homelessness. We have a largely deregulated private rented sector, and the rent for a very ordinary apartment in my constituency in the private sector would be, for a 2-bedroom flat, around £300 to £400 per week. Completely unaffordable for anyone on an average wage, which means that youngish people in their 20s or 30s, even 40s, either have to stay living in the parental home or have to share flats, and gross levels of overcrowding come as a result of it. And the private sector is making huge amounts of profits in this. And to buy anywhere is completely unaffordable. To buy a property in my constituency, again, I've given you a vague outline of what the place looks like, you wouldn't be able to buy anything for less than £500,000. And so it is a housing crisis beyond all housing crises at the present time, with large numbers of people sleeping rough as well at the bottom end of it. And so there is an urgent need for a big investment programme in council housing, but also control of the private rented sector and rent regulation, as you have to some extent in many parts of Germany. But again, as I understand it, all of that is under threat at the present time. So we're united across frontiers on this. Fourth point is about taxation and justice in our society. We've had tax write-offs for the very rich. We've had a reduction in corporation tax on many occasions, and at the same time we've had the underfunding of our National Health Service and the privatisation of our National Health Service. I'm very proud of that we have healthcare as a human right, free at the point of need in my society. That was achieved because of the bravery of the miners and many others in the 1920s and 1930s who fought for and campaigned for it. If we lose it, we'll never get it back. It won't come back. We will end up with a privatised, insurance-based health system. Health will once more become a commodity, not a right. Behind that, education will become a commodity, not a right. Everything would then be commodity, not right. So the fight for the National Health Service is about raising corporate levels of taxation and a wealth tax within our society. And that is our fourth point. The final point is the international one. It's configured around the rights of refugees. 60 million people around the world are refugees, no home to call their own. And when they arrive on our shores, in actually quite small numbers in Europe compared to the rest of the world, what do they face but racism, abuse, media harassment, and poverty in many cases? They are victims of war. They're victims of environmental disaster. They're victims of human rights abuses. They're the ultimate victims of a free market global economy. And so we have to have an international strategy that's based on humanitarianism, that's based on human rights, that's based on environmental sustainability, and above all is based on peace, not war, based on disarmament, not rearmament, based on a society that works for all. And so much of the discussion this morning has been about the war in the Ukraine, understandably. And I completely understand why that's the case. And the very disturbing news this morning about the Wagner Group and what it's doing in Rostov-on-Don. I haven't read all the analyses of it yet. I've looked at the BBC website with skepticism because I've got used to the BBC throughout the first period of my life. And secondly, I looked at the Al Jazeera website and a few others. And essentially, the Wagner Group is a product of the gangster capitalism of the Yeltsin years in the Soviet Union, the end of the Soviet Union. That group was created from apparently running a coffee stall on the streets of St. Petersburg, and in 25 years becomes a massive arms operation. Well, it's a rather strange growth of an organization over such a relatively short period of time, and I don't know how this is going to play out. But what I do know is I don't think there's any good outcome to this unless we're able to bring about a cessation of the war in Ukraine and peace for the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, and for the rest of Europe. And so I absolutely condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine as everybody else does here. There is no justification for it. It was not the right thing to do. What's resulted, firstly in Russia, has been the deaths of large numbers of young Russian conscripts, young working class men who didn't need to or deserve to die in this war. Mothers in Russia grieve just as much as mothers anywhere else or fathers anywhere else at the loss of their young ones. And the people in Russia that tried to oppose the war, the peace activists, have been marginalized and condemned, and actually not given a great deal of support anywhere else either, because they are people that want to live in this world in the same way that you and I do. And in Ukraine, thousands, hundreds of thousands have been driven into exile, and I'm glad to say that for the most part, all across Europe, where most have gone, they've been welcomed and well received, and I certainly welcome and support them in my own community, and they've been well treated, and that's how it should be. I just wish the same treatment would be given to refugees coming from Yemen, from Somalia, from Sudan, or somewhere else around the world, and give them the same level of support. And so what is missing from all this is the discussion of peace. Every parliament across Europe is discussing an increase in arms expenditure, discussing sending more and more lethal weapons to Ukraine. Britain has been sending depleted uranium-tipped missiles to Ukraine. Look at the cancer levels in southern Iraq from the use of depleted uranium during the Gulf War of 1991 to see what the effect will be on the people of Western Russia and the people of Eastern Ukraine for decades to come, as the cancerous mess that comes from the use of depleted uranium in an explosive has an effect on the people. Wars don't go away. They leave a residue of hatred and bitterness for years to come. So what's missing from this are the arguments for peace. Why was it that the very brave delegation of African leaders led by Cyril Ramaphosa to go to Kiev, then go to St. Petersburg and try and promote a ceasefire in order to bring about a peace, got almost zero coverage on the global media stage? Why was the call made by President Lula Inácio da Silva of Brazil at the G7 summit for a ceasefire completely ignored? I asked our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, I said, what response did he give to President Lula da Silva's request for a ceasefire in Ukraine in order to bring about a long-term peace process? And his reply was, I couldn't disagree with Mr. Corbyn more than I do at the moment. Huh? I was calling for peace. I was calling for negotiations. I was calling for an end to this war. We all know there's going to be peace talks at some point. We all know there's going to be a conference at some point in Geneva, in London, in Washington, or somewhere. I don't know. There's going to be one. Why don't we go to it now? The Pope recognizes that. The Latin American leaders recognize that. The African leaders recognize that. So many others recognize that. Why can't we go to that place now and get on with it? Because the consequences are appalling. The consequences of the people of Ukraine and the consequences for all of us. Your defense expenditure is going up to 2%. Ours is already past 2%, and it's like one of those long-running marathon races where the people that are organizing the race start off by saying the race is 40 kilometers, then you get to 35 kilometers, they say, actually, it's 45 kilometres. Okay. So you get to 40 kilometres, say, sorry, we've had to increase it to 50 kilometres. So you get to 45. They say, sorry, guys, it's 55 kilometres. So wherever you get, it's always another 10 kilometres to go. And so whatever the increase is in defence expenditure, somebody pops up from one of these ever so well-informed and well-funded and well-financed think tanks, usually funded by British Aerospace in our country, but different other places, to say, well, actually, 2.5% is just an aspiration. We need to increase that to 3%. In reality, what they're calling for, because of the levels of previous defence expenditure, is a doubling of the defence budget in Britain. Well, as you're pointing out, you double defence spending. Are you going to increase taxation to pay for that? No. What you're going to do, cut education, cut health, cut housing, cut environmental protection, make people work longer, increase, in our case, national insurance contributions, and so it goes on. You cannot afford to pay for all this stuff and at the same time pay for the level of public services that are so desperately needed by the people that we represent. And so let's make that declaration of peace. That's why Yanis Varoufakis, myself and others launched the Athens Declaration in Athens, and it's got a lot of support, and we need to keep up that pressure and use the language of peace. And next month, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference Committee opens in Vienna. Very important for us to support that process, because look at the war in Ukraine. There are nuclear weapons available in Russia, the United States, and NATO. Is this thing either going to degenerate into a nuclear war? It doesn't really matter how many nuclear warheads NATO has or Russia has. You only need to use one once, and millions die as a result of it. That is the nature of nuclear war. Likewise, a strike on a nuclear power station, an even bigger one than Chernobyl caused havoc and deaths for decades to come, will have the same effect all across this continent. The cause of peace is absolutely vital now to bring about an end to this war and bring about just a proper way of living for the people of Ukraine and Russia. And if anyone wants to understand what the effects of war are, I would just urge them to study or visit Afghanistan. Remember the rush to war in 2001 after the horrors of 9/11. Remember all that. The US Congress voted with only one person, Barbara Lee of California, voting against it, to give the president untrammeled powers to do whatever he wanted to do. That took us into war in Afghanistan. 21 years, billions of dollars later, tens of thousands of lives lost, hundreds of thousands of refugees. What have we left behind? But desperation, poverty, a loss of whatever rights women had at the time of that invasion, and a damaged and semi-destroyed society. That is what wars do. That is what they leave behind. And so, if we on the left can't offer an alternative to the economic poverty and deprivation that's existing across Europe, can't offer an alternative to the siren cries for wars, and can't offer an alternative to poverty and inequality, then the far right will do that, because the far right are capable of mobilizing working class opinion on the basis, this time, of attacking refugees. It's some other minority in the future, some other minority in the future after that. That is what the far right do in order to bring in their own nasty repression. And I salute the bravery of all of you that have fought against the AfD in Germany, those that have fought against the rise of the far right in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, and elsewhere. And we need that unity of purpose to oppose the dangers of the rise of the far right. But merely offering people the, how should I put it, the cloud of a threat is not enough. It's not enough. We have to offer hope and opportunity and inclusion and participation and realization of ambition in art, in music, in culture, in life, and bring together that exciting movement, which is what the very core of the socialist movement is about. The socialist movement in its broadest sense is about the human spirit and its imagination to do good rather than to do destructive things to each other. That is where our strength lies. Rosa-Luxemburg was assassinated. Karl Liebknecht was assassinated. Juarez was killed. Keir Hardie died of a heart attack, but basically a broken heart, because of his anti-war activities had been defeated at the start of the First World War. Those wonderful people had a vision of the kind of world we could live in. In their memory, let's build that movement of hope, build that movement of excitement, build that movement of opportunity, so we bequeath to the next generation something much better than what's on offer at the present time. Thank you very much.